beautiful people, and welcome. In this video, we are solving quadratic equations using the method of completing the square. Now, this is an important method. You end up using this method also when graphing circles. So we're going to take it step by step. As always, I am human, so if I make a mistake, please let me know where the mistake occurs so that way we all may learn from it. Let's get started. Now, we are going to be working with these steps as well as applying these steps to an example. Now, our example here is x squared plus 4x plus 3. And since we are solving the equation, it is going to be equal to 0. Step number 1 is to set the equation equal to 0, which we did. So I'm just going to rewrite the equation. Step number 2 is subtract the constant term from both sides. Now the constant is the term, we call it term C. So if we have our original term, it's ax squared plus bx plus c. That's our standard term, standard equation, excuse me. And the constant is this term here. It's that C term, that last third term. So our constant is 3. So I have my equation. And again, it's equal to 0. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. Now, if we had a minus there, then we would add to both sides. But in this case, we do have a plus, so we're going to subtract. Undo that step. So I'm going to subtract or add. So here we are. So we have x squared plus 4x equal to, now this goes away, negative 3. We're going to divide all the terms by the leading coefficient if there is one. So leading coefficient is your a. So a is this guy here. If you have a leading coefficient, it would be the number in front of x. In this case, we don't have a number in front of x. That number here is 1. So if we divide all terms by the leading coefficient, for this specific example, it would be dividing it by 1. Since we don't have a change when we divide by 1, we're just going to keep it. So this is how it would look like if you had a number not 1. So you would divide by that leading coefficient. And again, that number, this what you're dividing by, comes from that leading coefficient. And in this case, what do we have? Shift that over here. We have a x squared plus 4x equal to negative 3. So nothing changes for us. Step number 4, it says, in a thinking bubble, take b and divide it by 2. So you're always going to take your middle term. So whatever that middle term is, that number in front of your variable, you're always going to divide it by 2. So here's my equation. So x squared plus 4x is equal to negative 3. We're going to take this middle number with the symbol in front of it, right? You're going to take that in a thinking bubble, kind of somewhere off to the side. So we're taking b divided by 2. In this case, we have 4 positive divided by 2, and that equals to 2. Step number 5, take the b divided by 2, in this case our answer was 2, and square it. You should have b divided by 2 squared. So this is your c value. So what did we get? Step number 4 told us b divided by 2, which was 4 divided by 2, which was 2, and I'm going to take that number now, and I'm going to square it. So 2 times 2 is 4. Now I'm not saying multiply 2 twice. I'm saying 2 times 2. Add this new c, step number 6, add this new c to both sides of the equation. So what did we have for our equation? For our equation, we had x squared plus 4x is equal to, now I'm going to save some space here, negative 3, and I'm going to save some space here. So I'm going to add to both sides. And what am I adding? I'm taking what I have here and I'm going to add it to both sides of the equation. So this is what I had was 4. And I'm adding it. factor the trinomial. So now what we're doing is we're going to take this trinomial. We're going to factor it. Now this is now a trinomial with a leading coefficient of 1. Since we have a leading coefficient of 1, we can factor using the guess and check method. So here's my bubbles, here's my x, here's my x. So two numbers that multiply to get 4, but add up to get positive 4. In this case, it's 2 plus 2. And you're always using this method, you're always going to get a perfect square here, meaning you can rewrite this as bubble squared, but you don't have to. On this side here, you're going to just simplify this. So negative 3 plus 4 is 1. Before we move on to step number 8, I'm actually going to undo that step and add a few more steps because I don't feel like we're there yet in solving for x. There's a few other things that we have to do. So we're just going to remove that step number 8. So step number 8 is going to be a little bit different than what we originally had planned. So for step number 8, what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to rewrite your equation in the form of a perfect square. So here is rewrite trinomial factors. So you're going to have factors like this, right? As a perfect square. So in our case, let me take a look here. I'm going to peek in here to see what our original equation was. Not original, but what our equation here was. So we had the original equation as x squared plus 4x plus 3. Then we have, after completing the square, now we have x squared plus 4x plus 4 equal to negative 3 plus 4. Then we wrote this out as a factored trinomial. So here's two binomials that multiply together to give me this here. And we simplified that right-hand side, which is a positive 1. Now, what I'm asking you to do in step number 8 is these two factors, I'm going to ask you to write them as x plus 2 squared equal to 1. Step number 9 is you're going to square root both sides. So this gives me x plus 2 squared equals to 1. And we're going to square root both sides. Now, square root undoes this square. There's a secret 2 in here. A lot of times you won't see it. But there's a secret 2 in here that undoes this exponent of 2. So what you're going to be left with is just the inside material of x plus 2. Now here on this side, the square root of 1 is 1. But again, mathematicians, we're a little lazy. There's always a plus and minus here when you're solving and taking the square root. So that means I have a plus and a minus of 1 because 1 times 1 is 1. Also, negative 1 times negative 1 is also 1. So we have plus and minus. So now at step number 10, you're going to create or you're going to have two equations. So you're going to have something equal to 1 and you're going to have something equal to negative 1. Now, I am going to remove that just because, let's say positive and negative. And I don't want to specify 1 because it's not always going to be 1. It's going to be whatever the square root of this value is. One of them is going to be positive, one of them is going to be negative. So in our case, in our example, we have x plus 2 is equal to a positive 1 and x plus 2 equal to a negative 1. I'm going to subtract 2 both sides. So x is equal to a negative 1 And I'm going to also subtract 2 here, which gives me x is equal to negative 3. For your check, you're going to take these values, you're going to plug it into the original equation. So our original equation was x squared plus 4x plus 3 equal to 0. So I'm going to do this twice. I'm going to check once for when x is equal to negative 1. And I'm going to do this a second time for when x is equal to a negative 3. Now what I'm doing here is I'm creating bubbles where x's should be, so that way I have, oops, we're going to check if that's equal to 0. We're not sure if that equals to 0. And I'm going to put negative 1 for x, and I'm going to put a negative 3 in for x. Simplifying this, negative 1 squared is 1, plus negative times a positive is a negative, so I have a negative 4 here. You can omit this plus if you need to. Plus 3, so I have negative 1 and negative 4, that is a negative 3. Plus 3, that gives me 0. Therefore, this is a great answer. It does work. Let's try this. Negative 3 times negative 3, that is a positive 9. 4 times 3, that is 12 with the 1 negative, that means negative 12. And then plus 3 is left over. 9, 10, 11, 12, that means I have a negative 3 here after combining. And I have a positive 3 here, that means I do have 0. So that means I have both negative 1 and negative 3 for my answers. Now, before we move on to any examples, I wanted to point out a situation where we have no real solutions, where we don't have a solution to our equation. And that is once you have found your new C value. So in our current example, we have a plus 4 on this left side, this plus 4 on this right side. So once we have that, and if this ends up being a positive, then you're fine. You're good to continue. So this needs to be a positive value. You continue. However, if this part gives you a negative value, so you have your equation equal to a negative value, that means you do not continue and you have no solution. Let's start off with our example. I'm having my notes out here in front of us. There they are, so that way I can read through them. Step number 1 is set the equation equal to 0. There it is, done with step number 1. Step number 2 is subtract or add the constant term from both sides. So here's my constant term. This is my C value. So in this case, I'm going to add 16 to both sides. So I have 2x squared minus 4x equal to a positive 16. Step number 3 is divide all terms by the leading coefficient. Now, if you wanted to do that as your first step, that's fine. You can do that. This step here doesn't have to wait for the third step. You're dividing everything by 2 because this is our leading coefficient. So what do I have left over? This is 1x squared minus 2x is equal to 16 divided by 2. And 16 divided by 2 is that 8? I believe it's 8. It is 8. So once we are here, we're moving on to step number 4. In a thinking bubble, take b and divide it by 2. I'm actually not going to do it in a thinking bubble. I'll show you a different way to do it. What I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to drag this down. This is your b value. This is your b value. And what we want is b divided by 2. And in step number 5, you're going to square that value. So I'm just going to do it there. I'm not going to do it in a thinking bubble. So I have b is negative 2 divided by 2 squared. Negative 2 divided by 2, that's negative 1. Negative 1 squared is 1. So maybe it should have been in a thinking bubble since it's taken up so much vertical space. That's okay. Let's go ahead and bring this back up here. So this value, whatever you get, you're going to add to both sides. So in our case, I have a positive 1. So I'm going to bring this positive 1 and I'm going to add it back up to my equation. I want you to do to one side, you always have to do to the other side. And then step number 6 Oh, that is step number 6, is to add it to both sides. Step number 7 is you're going to factor your trinomial. Before I factor the trinomial, I'm going to write this out and simplify that right-hand side. So I have x squared minus 2x plus 1, and that's equal to 9. Now it's asking us to factor the trinomial. I want to point something out, you guys, that the value here, when you are dividing b by 2, this one here. So not before the division, but after the division, this value, that's a cheater way. So that's kind of like a hint or a cheat that this is going to be one of your factors, both of your factors. So when you're factoring, this is going to be your x, this is going to be your x, and then here, you're going to take this -1 from b divided by 2, and those are going to be your factors. Now, you don't have to remember that step. It just is helpful if you're stuck, and maybe sometimes you will have fractions. So always take b divided by 2 and place that as your factors. So x times x is x squared. -1 times -1 is a +1. But then I have x times -1, which is a -1. X times -1, which is a -1, which gives us a total of a -2x here. Step number 8 says rewrite the trinomial factors as a factored square. So I'm going to rewrite these factors as x minus 1 squared, still equal to 9. Then I'm going to square root both sides, step number 9. Square root both sides. And remember, when you're square rooting, this one here is always going to be a plus or minus. So there's a secret 2 here. This 2 and this 2, they go away. That's called an index. So I have an x minus 1 is equal to positive, negative. Now the square root of 9 is 3 times 3. So I have plus or minus 3. Step number 10 is create two equations. So I have x minus 1 is equal to a positive 3. X minus 1 is equal to a negative 3. Solving for x, I'm going to add 1 to both sides here. That means x is equal to 4. And adding 1 to both sides here, that means x is equal to negative 3 plus 1. That is a negative 2. So what that means is if you take these two values, you plug it into your original equation, that will give you an output of 0 when your input is 4 and an output of 0 when your input is negative 2. Let's do one more example. So here's an example with a fraction. Now sometimes you'll get a fraction when you are looking like the original equation, but sometimes the fraction will come out later. If it is the original equation, you can get rid of the fraction. If it comes later, you can't really do that. But if it is the original, you're going to take the denominator of the fraction and you're going to multiply each term by it. So I'm going to say 2 times 1/2 x squared plus 2 times 3x minus 2 times 14. And that way, these fractions, you're going to end up with larger numbers, but this fraction goes away. So I have x squared plus 6x minus, and that is what, 28, I think? Yeah, that is 28. So this is now the new equation that we're working with. Step number 1 is set this equation equal to 0. Let's shift this up. Step number 1, set this equation equal to 0. Step number 2 is subtract both sides or add. So in this case, we are adding. So I have x squared minus 6x is equal to 28. Step number 3 is divide all terms by the leading coefficient, We kind of already did that by multiplying by 2. We already took care of it, so that's okay. Step number 4, in a thinking bubble, take b and divide it by 2. So I didn't do a thinking bubble last time, so I'll do one here. So we want b divided by 2 squared. So b, what is our b value? Here's our b value, which is -6 divided by 2 squared. So -6 divided by 2, that equals -3 squared. -3 times -3, that's a +9. So this number right here, this +9, is what going to go on both sides of the equation, and we're adding it. So we have a 9 here and a 9 here. Simplifying that side, I'm going to write it down here below my arrow. I have an x squared minus 6x plus 9, and that's equal to 28 plus 9. That is a 37. Looking at my thinking bubble, I have a -3 in here. This -3 is a cheater way of knowing what your factors are. So I have x minus 3 and x minus 3. That's still equal to 37. You don't have to remember that the inside are your factors. You can just factor it the guess and check method. Then we're going to rewrite it. I believe we're on step number 8. We are going to rewrite it as x minus 3 squared. Now at this point here, I'm going to jump back up a few steps. When you've added 28 plus 9, make sure this is a positive 37. If you end up having a negative number here at this step, there's no point for you to continue. You can stop there and say no answer or no solution. In this case, 37 was positive, so we get to continue. So we are rewriting it. Now, 37 is not a pretty number to take the square root of. That is okay. So here's a secret too, that is called our index. So this index and this square root, this index and this exponent of 2, they undo each other. So I'm going to shift it here. X minus 3 is equal to plus minus the square root of 37. Here's a plus minus here as well. Now we cannot take the square root of 37. It doesn't simplify. So we leave it, and that's okay. It doesn't have to be a super pretty answer. It just has to work. So we are separating this out into 2 separate equations. We have x minus 3 is equal to a positive square root of 37. And here we have x minus 3 is equal to a negative square root of 37. When we are here, we're going to add 3 to both sides. Now, it's very important for you to understand that this is in a bubble. This is in parentheses grouping. You cannot group inside. So you basically can't go into the square root. You can only deal with the stuff outside. So when we are adding 3 to both sides, here you are having x left over on that left-hand side, and here you have 3 plus the square root of 37. And here this 3 is outside of the 37. Here we have x3 equal to 3 minus the square root of 37. So again, this 3 cannot go inside of the square root. It has to stay outside. So what are our answers? Answers for x is 3 plus the square root of 37 and 3 minus the square root of 37. Now sometimes you'll see it written as such, 3 plus and minus square root of 37. If you wish to combine it, that's fine. If not, you can leave them as separate answers. All right, beautiful people, thank you so much for watching my video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!